New York Giants head coach Brian Daboll would appear to now be coaching to keep his job as the team's head coach. Ed Valentine of Big Blue View here with a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. And I wrote earlier in the week when Brian Daboll announced that rookie quarterback Jackson Dart would take over for Russell Wilson. I wrote that that was the last card that Daboll had to play. And it really is. When you look at it, the Giants are an undisciplined team. The Giants have tried everything. They went through a bunch of quarterbacks last year. They've gone through, they fired Wink Martindale a couple of years ago as defensive coordinator, brought in Shane Bowen. They went from Mike Kafka as play caller to Daboll and now back to Kafka. They have revamped the roster. Joe Shane went out this offseason, spent a lot of money and a lot of draft capital to upgrade the defense. Got Abdul Carter with the number 3 overall pick, brought in Javon Holland and Paulson Adebo to help the defense. Got Daboll the quarterback that Daboll wanted in Jackson Dart, moved up in the draft to get that quarterback. And yet here we are with the Giants. 0-3, again off to a miserable start to a season for the third year in a row under Daboll's watch. I think 9-28 over the last 2+ seasons since they surprisingly made the playoffs in 2022 and won a playoff game, year in which Daboll won a Coach of the Year award and justifiably won that award. He earned it. They are 3-17 since the beginning of last year. They are 1-14 in their last 15 games. At some point, you run out of excuses. It's apparent that you've run out of answers. The Giants are an undisciplined football team. The same problems that cropped up in 2023 are largely the same problems that they have now. Even with different quarterback, different personnel, they don't score enough points. They don't score in the red zone. They don't run the ball consistently. They don't block consistently, especially in the run game these days. They don't create turnovers on defense. They have too many breakdowns. They get nothing special out of their special teams. There are too many instances where you look at the roster and you say, why did they construct it that way? Or why did they do A, B, or C on game day and leave themselves without a place kicker or leave themselves having to use Wan'Dale Robinson or Tyrone Tracy, one of their starters, as a kickoff returner? There's just too many times when you look at it and you wonder, what is the deal? And the football just isn't good enough. And the reality of it is, at this point in time, Brian Daboll has no other tricks up his sleeve. He took the play calling back. That didn't work. They moved on from Daniel Jones. So far, that hasn't worked. They tried they let Saquon Barkley go and tried to rebuild an offense another way. So far, that hasn't worked. And at this point, to me, Brian Daboll has to win games. And what has to happen here is that Jackson Dart has to look like a guy who could be the quarterback of the future. Looks like he could be that top 10, top 12 quarterback that you can go win with, that you can be a playoff contending team with. I wrote this week that it's unfair to put all of that on Jackson Dart, to put that expectation to more or less save Brian Daboll's job, to make all of the Giants' problems less noticeable. But that's where Brian Daboll is. If Jackson Dart looks in over his head, if it looks like they might have gotten this wrong, then Daboll has no chance to keep his job. The reality of it is, even if Dart looks like he could have a future, if the Giants don't play better, if they don't start to win some of these games, if they go 2-15 or they go 0-17, then there's no chance Brian Daboll keeps his job. Read a report from NJ Advanced Media that there are expected to be planes begging John Mara to make change. There's expected to be at least 2 planes, maybe more, flying over MetLife Stadium before Sunday's game against the Los Angeles Chargers. And John Mara ignored all of the planes that flew over, and he ignored the noise last year, and he kept Brian Daboll as head coach, and he kept Joe Shane as general manager, and I supported that at the time. I thought that this regime needed the opportunity to get its own quarterback, to draft a guy, try to develop a guy, and see where that goes. And I, fingers crossed, to be honest with you, that this looks good enough that the Giants don't have to blow this up and start from ground zero, or start all over again. I don't want to use the phrase ground zero. That for just that's just not an appropriate phrase for the New York Giants at this point. But I don't want them to have to start over at the beginning. So fingers crossed that it works. Unfortunately, I don't know that it will. And the reality from my perspective is this: I've already seen a report, or not a report, I've seen speculation that Brian Daboll could lose his job as early as Monday morning. As I sit here recording this on Thursday night, I'm not buying that report. But what I will say is the Giants have the Chargers this week in Jackson Dart's debut. They have the New Orleans Saints in week 5 in what will be Jackson Dart's second start. If they don't beat the New Orleans Saints, if they are 0-5 heading to week 6, I can certainly see a world where Brian Daboll is no longer the head coach of the Giants at that point in time. I think if they get to 0-5, it's absolutely inevitable that the Giants will need a new head coach. John Mara, Steve Tisch have been incredibly reluctant over the years to make mid-season firings, to do things like that. They did fire Ben McAdoo and Jerry Reese back in 2017 before the season ended. There were a lot of extenuating circumstances around that, a whole lot more than the fact that they were a bad football team. There was Eli Manning. There were players leaving the field, threatening to leave the stadium. There was Janoris Jenkins not coming back from the bye week and not bothering to tell anybody he wasn't coming back or where he was. There were players taking their problems anonymously to the media. The whole situation was a mess. It was embarrassing. And the Mara family they don't want to be part of that. So they fired McAdoo and they fired Jerry Reese. But they won't want to fire Brian Daboll mid-season, but they may have to, for the simple reason that at some point it's going to look inevitable that change is going to need to be made. So we'll see what happens. I do think that, like I said, I think Daboll is coaching for his job at this point. Giants have to win some games. If this doesn't look better and doesn't look better quickly, then I do think changes could be made for the Giants. I don't know if they would go to Mike Kafka as interim head coach. I don't know if they would go to somebody like Coach Andre Patterson, the defensive line coach, but that's really secondary. And if we get to that point, we'll start to discuss potential potential replacements for Brian Daboll, and even perhaps potential replacements for GM Joe Shane. Although I still think Joe Shane is on a little steadier ground than the head coach. But again, I've been wrong before. I could be wrong about that too. We'll have to we'll have to see how it all shakes out. But, fingers crossed that we don't get there. Anyway, what I also wanted to do today, I want to get to a couple of questions that that I received in the Big Blue View mailbag this weekend, or for this weekend, that I'm not going to be able to include in the written part of the mailbag. Um, so I thought I would address them here. Brian Misdom really wants to know. We're talking about Brian Daboll and his job status. Um, what really will it take for Daboll to keep his job? And Brian, I think we've already talked about it. Really, Jackson Dart's going to have to look like the answer. Some of the undisciplined play is going to have to go away. The Giants are going to have to win some football games. They're going to have to do better than 3-14, even though an 0-3 start, doesn't make that look easy. The schedule doesn't make it look easy, but at some point you have to make a change. You can't just continue to accept the losing and unhappy fans and planes flying over the stadium. At some point you have to try to start over. We'll move on to another question. Doug Mullen wants to know if I could go back and change a handful of decisions since the 2011 Super Bowl, what would they be? Doug references the 2015 decision by the Giants to move on from Tom Coughlin as head coach while keeping Eli Manning as quarterback and Jerry Reese as GM. And Doug, I have said many times over the years, I've referenced that particular decision as an inflection point for the Giants. Eli was getting older. He was still a good quarterback at that point. He maybe wasn't what he had been in the Super Bowl days, but he was still a good quarterback. And what always bothered me about that particular move, about pushing Coughlin out the door when he clearly didn't want to go, keeping Jerry Reese and keeping Eli Manning. At that point, John Mara stood in front of the media, and I was sitting in the room at the time, and I remember this. He stood in front of the media and he said, "This is not Tom Coughlin's fault. We haven't given him good enough players to work with. We haven't given him a good enough team to work with over the last few seasons." So it left me with the impression of, okay, you are firing the coach while you're saying it's the general manager's fault. So why is the coach leaving and the GM staying? And my thought has always been that the Giants would have been in a better place if they were going to push Coughlin out the door in 2000 after the 2015 season. Jerry Reese should have gone with him. Eli Manning probably should have gone with both of them, as much as everybody loves Eli, as much as I love Eli. But that would have been the perfect time to wipe the slate clean and start over. New head coach, new general manager, new quarterback to build around. Instead, the Giants did the half measure of letting Coughlin go, keeping the GM, keeping the quarterback, and they continued with the half measures until 2022 when they brought in Joe Shane and Brian Daboll at the same time. So my particular, my feeling is they had an opportunity to really jumpstart a rebuild and really get ahead, but that didn't happen. That could have happened in 2015, and that was a mistake. If they were going to force Coughlin to go, they should have pushed everyone out the door with him and done a complete clean restart. The other thing, and we could go through every single personnel decision and go on, about every missed draft pick and poor coach, poor assistant coach selection, poor head coaching selection. The one thing that I go back to, and I do not know if this would have worked. I do not know if it would have made a difference. But I wonder if at the end of the 2017 season, when Steve Spagnuolo was the interim head coach of the New York Giants, the Giants did a search for a head coach at that point in time and ended up hiring Pat Shermer, who was a nice guy. They hired Shermer as the adult in the room after all of the craziness of 2017. But Pat Shermer was clearly not a head coach with a vision for how to build a team, how to run a team, how to establish a culture, all of those things. I clearly remember talking to Shermer a few times, and he would say, well, you'd ask him why certain things got done, and he said, or why they ran this, or why they ran that, or why they did certain things a certain way. And his answer was never because that's what we're trying to build here in New York. That's the way we're trying to do things in New York. That's the culture that we want. That's the kind of player that we want. His answer was always, well, that's the way things are done in the NFL. And that's clearly not a man who had a vision for how he wanted to build his football team. Long story short, I wonder what would have happened at that point in time. And I know Steve Spagnuolo failed as head coach of the St. Louis Rams, but I wonder what would have happened if the Giants had given that head coaching job at that point in time to Steve Spagnuolo. Uh, obviously, Spags has gone on to have great success in Kansas City with Andy Reid. He'll probably go to the Hall of Fame as a defensive coordinator. But Spags loved New York. He still loves New York. New York loved him. He deserved an opportunity and still deserves another opportunity to be a head coach should he want one. And in retrospect, I think the Giants might have saved themselves a lot of trouble had they simply given the head coaching job to Steve Spagnuolo at that point. Maybe it would have worked, maybe it wouldn't have worked, but it certainly couldn't have turned out any worse than the Pat Shermer and Joe Judge eras turned out for the New York Giants. Final question. Eric Chavez asks, do you think Daniel Jones' success in Indianapolis will factor in at all to what Mara does with Joe Shane and Brian Daboll? It's certainly not a good look, but of course it's only been 3 games for Jones. Eric, I really don't think that what Daniel Jones is doing in Indianapolis will factor into the decision. It's obviously not a good look for the New York Giants. It obviously backs what John Mara said a couple of years ago, that the Giants had done everything they could to screw up Daniel Jones. It's obvious that the Giants didn't get out of Daniel Jones what Shane Steichen and the Indianapolis Colts seem to be capable of getting out of Daniel Jones. That's not a good look for Brian Daboll. That's not a good look for Joe Shane in terms of the roster that Shane put around him. It's not a good look for Brian Daboll in terms of his reputation as a quarterback whisperer, as a guy who could get the best out of quarterbacks. He did that for a year with Daniel Jones, and then seemed to stray from the things that they did well together in 2022 and wanted Jones to do other things, and that wasn't going to work. But the bottom line is wins and losses. 9-28 since 2022. Clearly no real ability, no real answers in terms of why the Giants continue to start the season miserably every year, why they don't play well in their season openers. No real answers as to why they can't play better offense, why they can't get the ball to their best players, why they can't get better quarterback play, with a head coach who's known for teaching quarterbacks, with an offensive coordinator with the reputation of a Mike Kafka. Why can't they get better play out of their quarterbacks? Why can't they score more points? Why do they consistently seem to have one of the worst offenses in the league? Why do they have the same defensive problems year over year, no matter who the defensive coordinator is, no matter who the players are. It they don't stop the run well. They didn't really stop the run well with Wink Martindale as defensive coordinator. They don't stop the run well with Shane Bowen as defensive coordinator, and that was one of the reasons that Brian Daboll hired Bowen, was because he thought Bowen would have the answers to the run defense. They don't create enough turnovers. They don't come up with opportunities. They don't make the plays that are there to be made that make the difference between winning and losing, whether that's on offense or defense. Um, there's too many times when they don't seem prepared. There's too many times when they don't have answers on the roster for situations that come up. So I don't think it has anything to do, whatever decision gets made is not going to be about Daniel Jones. There's no question, though, that Daniel Jones doing what he's doing for the Indianapolis Colts, playing early in the season at what some people consider to be an MVP level, there's no question that that's a bad look for the New York Giants. But these days, Eric, just about everything seems to turn into a bad look for the New York Giants. Everything they seem to try turns to mud. So I don't know. It's not going to be about Daniel Jones. It's going to be about this franchise just continually spinning its wheels and not seeming to be able to get any better the way things are right now. Anyway, Giants fans, that's the show for today. As always, I appreciate the support. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.